Lights, camera, action. Wow, that got me really excited. Thank you, everybody, for being here today, online, in person. My name is Sylvester-Chaudhuri. I am the executive director of a nonprofit called CivLab. We work in New York, Detroit, and London, working with various different stakeholders on urban innovation, looking at how you identify urban problems, solve them, and scale them. Cornell Tech has been a great partner in the Urban Tech Hub for a number of years. And this year is especially special because we work together on Smart Cities New York Urban Tech Summit. So first, I want to thank the Cornell Tech team and family for all their hospitality the past few days and few months. Particularly want to give a shout out to Anthony Townsend, who wrote this Urban Tech Futures Horizon, which we are about to jump into. So I hope I give this section of it justice. I'm joined by three esteemed panelists, two of which who I've had the great opportunity of working with for years, and one I wish to work with for years after today. First, I'm going to start with Liz Sisson, who was recently at Urban Us and the Harvard Belfer Center. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you. You want me to expand a little bit more on that, or? Let's
give it a second.
Okay.
Then I'm going to go to Dominique, and Dominique is at Generate Capital. We were chatting a little bit earlier. I think I'm going to be selfish and relate this back to myself. Each one of you has done things that I've always wanted to do in my life, so I want to be all three of you when I grow up. But Dominique spent time working in the renewable energy and solar space and is now at Generate, which we just saw Jigar Shah from the Loan Guarantee Program, so he was one of the founders and chairmen, so welcome, Dominique.
Thank you.
And David Gilford, who was previously at the EDC, who we had the privilege of working together on building urban innovation labs in the Urban Future Lab, who then spent time over at Intersection, then HRNA, and is now at Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. So welcome, David. So just to kick us off, David, let's just start with you. This is Urban Innovation Industrializes. You've been at this from the government perspective and private sector. Now you're even at it from a capital perspective. How throughout the years have you seen urban innovation industrialize?
Thanks, Simon, and it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this, particularly as I know we'll go into, this is an exciting week to be having this discussion after the infrastructure bill finally passed, so I know that's something that deserves a little bit of a deeper conversation later. But just thinking back to when I first started working with Simon and others at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, it was 2009, and there was a lot of hype around smart cities even then. IBM had the sort of Smarter Planet initiative. There were mayors and others talking about the degree to which technology was going to improve life in cities. And I think sort of quite frankly, I think pretty much anyone would agree that that did not happen at that time. And I think there's been multiple cycles since then. And what I'm excited about today, and I hope we get to go into a bit, is the sort of combination of some really great bottoms-up, community-led visioning and problem-solving that's been happening over several years, both from the startup perspective, but also at the local government and community perspective. That's now combining with some maturity in the technology that supports this, as well as new approaches to capital. And I think that makes this an interesting moment to be thinking about, what does urban innovation look like when it's no longer a niche thing that's discussed in, or with like 4 people around a table, but actually something that, can engage and attract all of the people that are in this room and online. And that both sets up a tremendous amount of opportunity, but also means that it's so critical that we get this right, particularly if you think about the federal funding and attention that's here right now that doesn't come around more than once in a generation. So I think that it's a critical moment that I'm personally both excited about and a little bit nervous, because there's a lot of ways that this could go wrong too. So I want to make sure that these types of conversations highlight both what has worked in the past and also the things that we need to learn from.
So really quickly, let's just stay with you for a second. I think a lot of your work has to do with community-based infrastructure, digital infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about that digital infrastructure that is laying the groundwork for the rest of urban innovation?
Sure, and maybe just for context, I should say a little bit about Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, which exists to invest in and build technology-enabled infrastructure that makes places better from a perspective of resiliency, sustainability, equity, and so forth. But what that requires is both looking at the the real needs on the ground, and then pairing that with the solutions that exist, whether it's around the sort of the future of the electric grid and what individual decisions around wanting sustainable electric sources or having electric vehicles. What does that mean for kind of these bigger systems when you bring it all together? Or from a municipal leader perspective, if you are trying to plan to increase your recycling rate and are thinking about the balance between collecting more recyclables, but also making sure you ensure the quality of the waste stream, and thinking about like how you apply technology to really create new models that aren't all that different from the way that things, that cities work. I don't think this conversation is really about kind of reimagining cities or sort of starting over from a blank slate, but really building on the wisdom that exists in cities and kind of taking it to the next level with new tools.
So taking a step back from that, you mentioned the electricity grid, and a big part of powering our cities. We talked a lot about solar yesterday. Offshore wind just became legalized in New York. Dominique, can you talk a little bit about Generate Capital's approach to energy and investment into the sector, and what the relationship is with our cities?
Yeah, absolutely. So Generate is a sustainable infrastructure investment firm, and we invest across a number of different sectors, including energy. That is definitely where we spent a lot of time over the past 7 years since the firm was founded. And Generate's founding vision was really to be the capital partner for the resource revolution. What that really means to us is focusing on what we call the 4 Ds of the next generation of infrastructure, and that's really decentralized, democratized, decarbonized, and digitized. So we take that lens to all the different sectors we invest in. Within power specifically, we've spent a lot of time in community solar. That's definitely an area that we think fits those 4 Ds really well. And then we also focus on areas like energy efficiency, because that's also very much in the distributed area. And so we tend to think about it in terms of what is the best fit for a community, which often is a distributed solution. And it is a solution typically that does take into account the needs of a lot of different stakeholders. And so that's exactly what we do find with community solar, and that's very much the lens that we do take to all of the work that we do within communities, is ensuring that you have long-term alignment around what everyone is getting from a given project.
And I know that you guys have a diverse portfolio. It's not just solar. What are some of the other things that you think are going to be important for us to help solve our climate goals over the next couple decades?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, we have definitely a number of technologies in our portfolio. We have storage, fuel cells, energy efficiency, as I mentioned. We're one of the largest owners of anaerobic digesters, so we're very active in the waste and water space. I think we're going to need all of those things. I think it's something that we need everyone from a variety of different disciplines working on. And we have to really think about all of this from a customer-centric perspective. And so that's, again, how we kind of tend to approach what we find interesting. Maybe just another thing to note is that we invest very much for the long term. We're structured as a holdco, so we don't actually have the forced exit associated with a lot of typical fund structures. So we have to actually make sure that everybody is benefiting from what we're doing, and that we have really strong economic and social alignment around what we're doing. So yeah, I think that there's areas in all of those technologies that we're desperately going to need, and New York is a great example of that.
Thank you. So Liz, she mentioned the customer word.
The customer.
You have a long background with working with those innovations before they're necessarily ready to be put on top of David's infrastructure, financed by Dominique's infrastructure or capital. Talk to us a little about not just digital and broadband, not just energy, but what are some of the other areas of impact, and kind of what do you think is on the horizon for social impact investing over the next few years?
Yeah, and I'll give a little context to my background as well. I was formerly with these two on the investing side, but recently left Urban Us and Urban X. I had been doing research at the Belfer Center, like two of my colleagues who were on earlier panels, but mostly around bringing responsibility back to investors and thinking about the harms that they actually create in their investments. Oftentimes we talk about impact, right? We think greenhouse gas emissions, job creation, but a lot of times we don't talk about some of the major issues, obviously, with these venture-backed startups. So privacy, security, all the things that a lot of the panelists have already spoken about. So that word impact comes up often, right? And a lot of VCs will say, we think about impact, we think about ESG, and I always just say that's not enough. And so that's a lot of my research is thinking, how can we push beyond just thinking about impact and ESG? Because you actually can hide a lot of harm behind impact and ESG. So not just thinking about greenhouse gas reduction or thinking about how do we grow capacity for density, but how do we actually think about maybe lives being saved? How do we think about the everyday person saving money, not just, we think oftentimes about developers saving money, but the everyday person. So sort of really pushing beyond just the typical sort of urban or, and now this conversation is mostly around climate these days, but just really deeply thinking about stakeholders, underserved communities, and the things that really impact them. And so, yeah, that I would say not just jobs, not just greenhouse gas emissions, not just density, but like deeply thinking about some of the qualitative things as well.
And our next panel after this is going to be on urban living labs, but let's talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement here. David, in terms of what does stakeholder engagement look like for you, especially looking at things like broadband? I think one of the reasons I love this space so much is because it engages so many different stakeholders, but that also makes the job harder. But talk a little bit about how you see that and laying kind of the backbone for it.
Yeah, I think broadband is a great example to dig into for this because it touches every aspect of basically everyone's life at this point. And just thinking back over the past year and a half, going on 2 years, I think that the digital divide issues that cities are wrestling with are on the one hand not new at all, but they've become too central and salient to ignore. But I think that the exercises that I've seen cities go through in determining, for example, how do we connect our students who may need to go from studying in the classroom to studying at home on a moment's notice? How do we make sure that we're ready for that? A lot of the tools that people have used in the past to do that kind of planning break down when you think about this. If there are school districts that emailed out surveys and said, click here if you need a device or you need internet access, and you have the selection bias in there too, where you end up seeing like, oh, the problem is not that big a deal, and looking at the difference between a city that sort of took that approach versus one that engaged with neighborhood organizations that understand the individual characteristics of a neighborhood, and that we're able to use, whether it was through in-person gatherings, to the extent that those were available, or postcards, very labor-intensive things of making sure that there's not a sort of a structural bias in the way that these things are planned. And I think that goes through to not just connectivity, but then now if everyone has a laptop or an iPad and an internet connection, how do you empower them to actually be full participants in what that can enable? And I think that the role of a private company in that certainly can be supportive, but I don't think it should try to replace the fundamental need for community engagement between the government that represents people and the people themselves. Because when an RFP is issued or when a contract's being negotiated, the public sector is doing that on behalf of the people that they represent. And I think that there's a risk if sort of on the public sector side, you think, well, we can't figure this out right now. Let's see what the market says. Making sure that the business model ultimately is aligned is tricky in the best of cases. But if you don't, as the decision maker, have a real sense of what the problem is and what solutions have been tried in the past and have not worked, what are the levers to really focus on? I think that the overall structure of whatever sort of partnership emerges is not going to meet the needs. So I think that we've all learned from the experience of the past couple of years, but it's not a new thing. It's just sort of, you can look at old infrastructure and see the same sorts of issues as well.
So I think you bring up a great point. As a small nonprofit, we're quite used to ask for forgiveness, not for permission model. Don't tell any of our clients that, but maybe I just did. But I think Uber is a great example of that, right? Dominique, do you have any examples like similar in the energy space, or even can you just talk about this dynamic between government and energy investment, considering that you have all these different utilities, you have different markets that vary from state to state. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between government and the power that we're trying to get on the grid and invest in?
Yeah, definitely. I do think it goes back to the relationship between the private sector and the municipality. That's really critical. And actually to touch on something that David said and related to what Liz has been speaking to, the digital infrastructure space is something that Generate is also quite interested in, given how tied it is to sort of digitizing our infrastructure and to resource efficiency. Within that, we very much see open access fiber as being a pretty interesting space, and that's something that you kind of need to build a smart city, sort of ecosystem around. It's pretty critical, and that's something that's really easy to make mistakes in how you're rolling it out as far as access. And it's really important in something like that, for example, to make sure that you're not doing something like digital redlining. And that's where the city relationship really comes in as being critical to ensure that what the investor is actually building is very much aligned with their needs and is going to be something that at the end of the day, the entire community is very happy with for decades. Because I mean, this stuff really does last that long. I would say, we've had a similar experience as well in the power space. Like we, for example, did a huge rooftop solar project with about 88 sites on municipal schools here in New York City. And that took years to figure out. It's very complex. There's a lot of different stakeholders to align there. But if you don't have the right kind of relationship and very, very close day-to-day involvement between the investor or whoever you're partnering with on that project and the key stakeholders within city government, it just doesn't work.
And Liz, I mean, similar question for you. With anything that has to do with impact, usually government plays some role, and founders, especially if they're B2G, are often befuddled on how to incorporate that or how to do that smoothly. How do you see the role in government in accelerating innovation or even decelerating it?
Yeah, so at Harvard, I did a ton of research on investors' responsibility, but at the end of the day, there's also government responsibility to make sure that they're reducing harms as well. And I came up basically with a diligence guide that investors could use that I've actually gotten more inbound from government that wants to use it, because a lot of times, the innovation is moving so fast, and it's really hard for folks to really deeply think about all of these potential harms that could result from this innovation. So, and I think that there's a lot of times there is that disconnect between the private and the public sector, as we've been saying. And there are different philosophies, right? There's this, just be a bulldozer, sort of the ask forgiveness afterwards situation. And I think we'll see more of that. I think, especially as a lot of startups are there's a ton of capital to be had. They have more money for lobbyists and to sort of build up their policy teams that could sort of be bullies. But I do think that most evidence, or I think the best stories are the ones that the startups or the private sector, when they work nicely with the government, they create that relationship. The government learns more in that case, and it's a little bit more of a patient relationship. But I also think that the startups will learn a lot more. And I think oftentimes startups will say, I don't want to sell to government, I don't want to deal with that process, but especially now after this infrastructure bill, there's just a ton of money. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think, for us to really move the needle, we need to be working together. And it's not just the startups not being bullies, but it's also the government being open to having those conversations and making it a little bit easier for folks to get access to that capital or have access to cities. So
as the recovering investor on our panel, can you talk a little bit about the incentive? There's always an interesting dynamic between investors and their startups and what the investors want in terms of return, not just their capital, and LPs and GPs. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and impact of the capital behind the capital almost even?
I think it's interesting, and I'm just going to keep referring back to my research, but I talked to a lot of funds to get a better sense of how the GPs, the general partners, their comfortability talking about impact. And oftentimes, I talked to, for example, I won't name them, talked to one of the biggest prop tech funds and asked them about ESG and impact and harm reduction, and they were like, yeah, we have no idea what we're doing. Meanwhile, they have so much money, and they have invested in all the big prop tech companies. And that's really scary. That's very scary. But they don't have the incentive right now, they should, from their LPs, their limited partners, their investors, to really care about these things. And I think that dynamic between the startup founders caring is going to switch a bit more. I think founders are actually looking for investors who want to have these conversations that actually care about them. But there is some positivity. There are some LPs that are saying, you know what, we don't want to have any investments in surveillance tech. We don't want any investments in police or national security. They do exist. There's a few of them. And I think even with climate tech, you could tell LPs are getting a little bit smarter. And I'm looking at them in one large group. LPs are more interesting, and there's lots of different types of LPs. So I do think it's shifting, and therefore, GPs and investors need to get smarter with how they think about these things, not just for their investors, but also for their founders as well. There's a lot of room to grow, though.
And with COP26 just going on, and ESG has just, those three letters have never been said together in the history of the world.
I always remind folks, Facebook is a great ESG company. Like, if that tells you anything about hiding harms, obviously that's not urban innovation, but I think that's just something you have to come back to. Look at everything we're dealing with there.
Absolutely. And Dominique, personally as an investor, as an institution that's been doing this for a very long time, what does ESG mean to you? And is it enough that the Facebooks and big companies are doing that to actually move the needle for us?
No, I would say it's not enough. I do think we need vastly more capital moving into deploying, as Jigar said, deploy. The trend has been moving in the right direction, certainly. Sure. When I, entered the space in 2012, it's just extraordinary to see the progress that we've made in wind and solar, for example, since then, and how commodified that's become, which is great, actually. And even community solar now is starting to access really low-cost financing, and people have gotten comfortable with residential offtake, and it's really exciting to see all of that. We essentially need to continue pushing on all of those things. And I think the more that we can get case studies out there and learnings out there, the more that it's going to help encourage what people Jigar likes to refer to as mainstream capital to really move into the space and start figuring out the things that are right now seem either too hard or too risky to get into.
And I think, David, let's move to you, because I know you have a background in environmental business science and work at Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners looking at the urban environment. There's always been this interesting dynamic between clean tech, urban innovation, environmental science, climate change. How do you see it, or how does SIP see it with the work that you guys are doing, as I know you're doing a lot of different things?
Yeah, I think to the question around how people talk about ESG and the degree to which that's become mainstream, if that's a sign for hope or that things are happening or not. I probably come in somewhere in between, in the sense that it's great that people are sort of in normal conversation now will talk about the climate impacts of an investment or something like that. I think that is a good thing. I think to the extent that it's an add-on to a strategy, it's less impressive. I kind of am hopeful that at some point, relatively soon, we'll stop talking about ESG as a standalone thing. It's just the same way that we don't talk as much about a tech company versus a non-tech company, right? In terms of that every business has to think about technology. And for Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, certainly our approach to ESG is really that all of the areas that we're operating in, the fundamental premise of our investments is to solve what you could consider ESG goals, whether it's when we approach broadband, we're thinking about the digital divide. When we approach energy, we're thinking about sustainability and resiliency. When we approach transportation, we're thinking about GHG reductions and equity and various things like that. So I think to the extent you can, to the extent that people realize that it's not something that is severable, ESG is not something that's severable from your overall business, things will improve, because what we can't have is every company on the stock market just saying we are an ESG company and we got this certification, because I think then you're really sort of missing the opportunity, which is to rethink what it is that we're actually building and delivering.
That's great. And so when we talk about sustainability investment, we're not just talking about companies, right? We're also talking about assets. And there's obviously the power generation side of things, but in New York we have Local Law 97. It's going to require all building owners to reduce their carbon footprint. We're going to need technologies to get there. But David, can you talk a little bit about the role of just assets, physical assets in accomplishing goals, and how capital plays a role in that?
I think one of the biggest challenges in urban innovation is the disconnect between the speed at which innovation happens in the digital world and how long it takes to build physical things, whether that's infrastructure or even whether it's just getting through processes that have been around for, in many cases, 100 years or more. I think that means that the ability to match technology with a project is not just about, does this make sense from a sort of a theoretical or technical perspective, but can we align timeframes in a way that it makes sense for, for say, an investor who has a particular return horizon. And sort of similar to Generate, Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners is also structured as a holding company, in part for that reason that we don't know exactly how long it will be optimal to hold an investment. And we're talking about assets that in many cases may last for 30 plus years, which is a time horizon that's very different from thinking about enterprise software or consumer software or things like that. So I think that there needs to continue to be innovation in how we align those very different speeds, the speed at which we know that there's going to be new digital technologies in the next 5 years, while some major projects are still sort of working their way through permitting and approvals and all of that. I think that's, whether we're talking about from an investment perspective or a public policy perspective, I think that's just a central thing that we can't avoid. Otherwise, I think when people have attempted to kind of avoid that, what it's led to is just low-hanging fruit innovation, where it's something like, okay, well, we can replace this paper-based process with a digital process. And that's great, that improves efficiency, but it doesn't fundamentally change the assets themselves.
And Dominique, do you have any comment on even the role of government or even PPPs within that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the role of government at its sort of most basic level is actually not different than the role of what would be a good partner in the private sector. And I think personally, I think the two most important things are just providing clarity and consistency when you're working through a process. And this stuff, I mean, I think we all know, like, this stuff is really hard. It's really hard to deploy infrastructure. And it does involve a lot of time and a lot of people from different types of disciplines. And so to the extent that you can be thinking about this ahead of when you want to start a project process, for example, to the extent that you can try and have as many people involved be consistent over the period of time that you're working together on that, it can really help.
So Liz, I want to jump from physical infrastructure to talking about civil and social infrastructure.
Sure.
We don't have all day, because I know you could talk about this for all day. But what is the role for urban tech within our civic and social infrastructure?
I think to everything that I was talking about earlier, I mean, when we talk about impact, when we think about privacy and security, when we think about labor and we think about inequality, when we think about long-term value creation, right? Like, a lot of innovation, and we see it all the time, it solves like a short-term problem, but in the long run, it maybe sort of goes backwards or it is not serving the population that it was supposed to or intended to. So, and I think just making sure that we remember that when we make investments, either in the long term, 30 plus years, or even in a traditional VC fund, a little bit shorter term, and thinking about, maybe this isn't the right avenue for investing, right? There's some innovation that you see that VC money is thrown at it, but it maybe shouldn't be VCs investing in it, right? Maybe there are other avenues that have slightly more patient capital. And something that, David said, thinking about, VC is very comfortable with software. VC is not as comfortable with hardware, but a lot of this requires hardware. And a lot of the hardware has software, but the sort of expectations for growth and returns, a lot of times for urban innovation that really moves the needle is not on that same timeline. And so I think it's adjusting expectations. I think it's startups and the people that are innovating understanding where they should be going for capital. And I'm always thinking about Mariana Mazzucato, an economist that I love at UCL, who always says, the government is also an innovator, and we should not forget that. It's not just Silicon Valley. It's not just VC that needs to be providing capital for a lot of these things, but we also need to think about patient capital, and the government is oftentimes the place to get patient capital.
Absolutely. So you mentioned hardware innovation, software innovation. One thing Jigar Shah, who we had earlier, is famous for is business model innovation and looking at purchasing the PPP model of deploying solar, Sun Edison, Solar City model. Is there anything, I'm going to throw this up to actually all three of you, is there anything out there within business model innovations that you've seen of recent that has the ability to help us deploy? Or with all these great entrepreneurs in the room, is there an area where you think we have more room for business model innovation to help us scale technologies and innovation we already have?
Well, one place where I could start is talking about the P word, which hasn't really come up that much yet, which procurement, right? Which is a good word or a bad word, depending on who you're talking with, but it's probably the single biggest lever that government has to shape things, because every level of government buys all kinds of things, and the processes by which procurement happens shape the solutions that we get. And so, whether it's talking to a startup who's read about the infrastructure bill and is trying to figure out, is there an opportunity for me there? Or a city manager who's thinking about the fact that they now have a climate goal that requires them to electrify their fleet, but needs to figure out how to install charging stations. The sort of the nexus between the public and private sector typically is an RFP or maybe an RFI or something like that. And the different levels of capacity that exist among levels of government right now is concerning to me when you think about ideally having government also having a level playing field when it comes to, say, federal support and being able to find innovative solutions. I was privileged to work in New York City government, where we had an incredibly talented group of people with deep knowledge, and even so, we would still struggle sometimes on figuring out what's the right structure to move this forward. But when you go to a smaller city or town, they have to rely heavily on consultants. They have to rely on the private sector to some extent in terms of helping them shape RFPs, honestly. And I think that means that there's potentially a gap between what could be done with the government money that gets put into the private sector through procurement and what actually happens. I think the New York City, in the broadband side of things, I think there's a good example of the New York City Internet Master Plan, which I was also fortunate to work on as a consultant in a previous role, which maybe you'll be talking about elsewhere in this upcoming sessions tomorrow. But basically, in that, it was realizing that the city has tremendous assets, physical assets, rooftops, poles, buildings of all sorts, that could be made available to a variety of private sector innovators to deliver high quality, low cost internet service in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And the way that they went about doing that through an RFP recently was to make available through the city's open data portal 100,000 physical assets and share information about that, and then let people propose how to use that to deliver service, not being prescriptive, but being prescriptive in the sense that the service must comply with some stated principles around net neutrality, around affordability, around privacy, and things like that. That's a heavy lifting for the city to do, and not every city is going to be able to do that, but I think that sort of model shows the way in which the actual procurement mechanism impacts directly the type of solution that gets delivered, as well as to the extent to which startups can participate in that.
So procurement.
Procurement.
Okay.
Procurement.
Dominique,
Also, the pilots is another P word we might want to talk about.
Pilots, okay.
Yes, good one.
Dominique, did you want to add to that, or did you have a?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think generally the infrastructure as a service model has really unlocked a tremendous amount of capital moving into deployment, and that's essentially what the PPA did, and that's what different types of contract structures have done in other sectors. So I think it really is going to continue to be about how to roll that out for different applications. Like, how do you do that in waste to value? How do you do that in EVs? And generally just thinking about, as well, just like what are the various pieces of value in a given project or a given technology and all the different stakeholders, and what do each of the stakeholders want? And how do you allocate that in ways that actually makes it viable? So you can think about that in terms of like there's a company doing mobile data centers essentially, and like basically generating power from what would have been flared methane. And then that is actually taking what was a cost for oil and gas producers and turning it into a revenue stream. I mean, you can debate if that's something you actually want to do, but that's something that would actually roll out or cause that solution to be rolled out. Or like EV charging software solutions that allow you to actually do grid services that can have value and help you share the value stack with both EV drivers and with utilities, for example.
That's a great example.
Like, that makes a lot of sense for a lot. So you have to figure out what are the economic levers for each of the different stakeholders involved, and how do you actually use that to just like go,
I love that example. Let's you go to the other P word, pilots. Liz, what do pilots mean to you?
What do they mean to me?
And all the various.
With my investor hat on or off.
With your investor hat and the study you wrote, and you can even dive into some of the other areas you looked at in the study. I'm not sure if startups need more pilots.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, oftentimes I think startups will fall into the trap of pilots, right? There's a free pilot. some people say, oh, well, at least it shows that you traction, you learn a little bit about your product, you learn a little bit about your customer, you don't have to worry about RFPs, you don't have to worry about procurement, but at the end of the day, then you're not making any money, and it maybe is like distracting you from building for a customer that will actually pay. I do think, I mean, I don't want to completely crap all over pilots, because I do think that it helps the city sometimes, in some cases, maybe learn a little bit. And it does, I think there's a lower sort of barrier to entry. I think when many times startups are intimidated by the government, right? They don't know how to work with it. If there isn't someone on the team that has an understanding of procurement or has not worked in that space, you know, it's sort of hard to figure out how to get in. So what we have seen also is there's pilots that come out of the private sector as well, right? You see, or business improvement districts sometimes will allow for pilots. And honestly, when, you know, some of our startups have done them, I would say 50% have gotten something out of it, 50% haven't. And so you don't really know. But as I've told many people in the New York City government, make sure you're also providing money for these folks, right? Like that's free labor, essentially, right? If you're providing a solution. And I also think that there isn't that guardrail, again, sorry, I'm going to beat on this, but that harm reduction, that sort of, you know, procurement exists in theory, so we reduce, you know, harms or fraud or whatever. I don't know if that actually works, but I think a lot of times the sort of backdoor sometimes is creating sometimes some issues as well.
So reduces harm, fraud, and innovation.
What do you think about pilots?
I personally, I think I totally agree. I think startups get too caught in; they waste too much of their capacity and energy doing them. But also it depends who the pilot's for. Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. If it gets you on the front page of the New York Times, that could, you know, bring other benefits. I don't know if anyone knows of any pilots that got them on the cover of the Times.
For something good too. There's definitely things that go wrong there.
I'm not sure if Brian Boyer's still here. He moderated our first panel today, but he has he's running the urban tech program at the University of Michigan. Not to promote other urban tech programs around the country, but but Brian has written about platform urbanism in the past, and I have now taken that term more loosely in thinking about physical and digital platforms for building innovation on. You know, the grid, the organization we run with the EDC has 130 different organizations working together on top of it. So David, you know, we keep talking about digital infrastructure, laying the groundwork. Like, what is the opportunity there for startups to play and for startups to use it as a lever to increase innovation?
I think everything we've been talking about the sort of challenges about pilots and procurement applies to digital infrastructure as well, with the possible exception that, you know, digital infrastructure for a lot of tech-enabled things is the sort of the base layer. And so you might not be, as a startup, able to provide that base layer, but the fact that, say, a business improvement district has free Wi-Fi, to pick like a very basic example, may enable you as a startup to do something that would otherwise not be economical or possible. So I think some of it is, and this is also from a business model perspective, is finding sort of private-to-private partnerships that enable you as a smaller company to work productively with government versus trying to sort of do the entire thing yourself. You know, I think piloting digital infrastructure is challenging in the sense that both there may be asymmetric risks and rewards from a city's perspective. If they're working with a company that doesn't have something that has been sort of proven at scale, the potential for something to go wrong, whether it's around sort of a cybersecurity incident or just sort of negative public perception, may outweigh from the public sector's perspective the advantages of actually doing that. And that's something that affects pilots, but particularly it's like post-pilot, if you wanted to then have, you know, to win an RFP. I think the dangerous thing for a startup is you might put a ton of sweat equity into kind of convincing local decision makers of why this is something worth doing. Participate in a pilot, maybe you get paid a little bit of something, maybe you don't, but then ultimately like a large company comes in and wins because you've now kind of proven out the business case, both for the public sector as well as your competition. So I think it's also to say is that you have to be careful, but I think thinking about, you know, where within the sort of the technology stack of whatever the problem is you're trying to solve, you as a smaller company can best play, where you don't necessarily need to take on everything just as a startup 20 years ago had to buy a bunch of servers, and now they just run on AWS or Google Cloud Platform. I think the same thing will happen in urban tech.
And Dominique, thinking about your position at Generate, the private sector, and this new infrastructure bill, how might the new infrastructure bill be a platform for platform urbanism, for deploying, and some of these new technologies out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great to have the support, certainly. I think we generally don't tend to rely on that or have that drive our strategy, because I think a lot of this stuff is happening anyway. There definitely are areas where that funding will be helpful, like where it's a little bit harder for the private sector to step in, like in certain areas where it's, the returns just don't pencil. That tends actually to be more in rural locations for a lot of this stuff. But I do think it's going to help just make the space more sophisticated. It's going to help, kind of to your point around like government driving innovation. I do think it's really going to help bring down some of those cost curves that would benefit the whole space.
And Liz, from a government perspective,
I don't think I should ever speak on a government perspective.
Well, you said they need their centers for innovation, as Mariana says. I mean, do you think that local government, not necessarily federal government, how could they potentially use this infrastructure bill as an opportunity?
I don't know, but I was just talking to a startup, and the founder told me a funny story about how a couple cities he has been working with, and he sells directly to government, received a bunch of federal money, just as much as they will continue to. And basically part of his strategy of selling to the government right now is educating the city on how to use the federal money. And so like half of his business development right now is explaining that this federal money could be used in other ways. And so I thought that was just like super interesting that like now half his job is like educating the city government on how to use the federal government, that there's like this little loophole that they're taking advantage of and getting like tremendous amounts of traction because of it. And so I think, and we were just talking about, some startups are saying, how are we going to be able to take advantage of the infrastructure bill? Mm-hmm. Historically, they've always said, I don't have access to federal money. I'm not going to get the grants. It'll be the big corporates and the folks that know how to respond to RFPs. And so figuring out how can startups take advantage of that money. But I just thought that was an anecdotal little thing that just happened this morning. And so I just thought it was interesting that like half of his job now is like educating these small cities on how to take advantage of that federal money.
Final question for everybody. We'll start with you, Liz.
Okay.
We're at Cornell Tech. There are all these great students studying urban tech in the audience, entrepreneurs, innovators. What's the problem that you think they should solve? Or any advice you can give them as they pursue the next stage in their career, or we all pursue our next stage of our careers?
As you said, I'm a recovering investor, and so I would say, I think a lot of people see there's a ton of capital going into climate tech. There's a ton of capital going into urban innovation. Don't become an investor. Just build. build, do cool things. Don't become an investor. That's mine.
So next we have a investor on the panel. Dominique, same question.
Love it. That's the answer I generally give when people ask me if they have to do investment banking. But I would say the thing that it focuses mostly on your work, Simon, as far as like the thing that I think is key to kind of unlocking a lot of this, and it's just figuring out the integration of all the different pieces of people working on this, both from the private sector, from the public sector, from the technology side. That I think is really important to have a bit more of a systems view on this stuff. And I think that city leadership has a really key role to play there, because if you think about it, I mean, there's really no centralized infrastructure planning authority in this country in general, which has been part of the challenge that we have in changing our infrastructure. But with cities, it's a little bit easier. It's a little bit more manageable to kind of take a systems view and think about the whole city holistically, so you don't have people deploying this technology over here, a little bit over there, and none of it really talks to each other and is very well integrated. So that, I think, is an interesting thing to spend some time thinking about, even if you're focused in one area specifically.
Let me know where to send the invoice for the plug there. I appreciate that one. David?
And one of the great things, if you can call it a great thing about urban innovation, is just how many problems there are, right? So that you can almost think of whatever it is that you're interested in and figure out not just one, but like 100 possible problems you could be working on. So I think from from just a sort of a personal perspective, I got into this world initially through work I was doing in sustainability, which led me to thinking about energy and then renewables. And then from there, it became things about how does that integrate with digital. And so I think there's so many different paths that, that all kind of converge around this sort of broad concept of urban innovation. The other sort of piece of advice, and again, this is maybe just my personal experience, is that spending time, whether you want to be an investor or you want to be someone in government or you want to be a startup or a corporate person, having spent time on the other side of the table is incredibly important, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings at every level, even as you get senior into organizations, of the motivations of the sort of people you're negotiating with or trying to come up with a constructive deal with. And so for me, like the stuff that I remember very well from sort of time in the public sector is about what it feels like to be not just writing a proposal, but being like running a committee that's reviewing it and thinking about the risks and all that stuff, which is stuff that you can't really learn in the classroom. I think it's great to look at case studies, but there's sort of getting to spend at least a little bit of time as a practitioner of that, I think gives an insight that's hard to get otherwise.
Thank you so much. So for the sake of time, unfortunately, we won't be doing a Q&A, but I encourage you to mob our panelists after the show to ask them questions. Really quickly, you're going to see a video play. It will be the fourth and final of our urban tech ecosystem sessions. Yesterday, we had a great video from the folks in Berlin, as well as Detroit. Earlier, we saw Singapore. It will be a little bit awkward because I'm the one moderating this discussion. My colleague Helena in London got caught up with COP26, but you'll see that discussion. You're going to see an awesome panel after that on Urban Living Labs. But before that, please join me in thanking this great panel.